Picture this. A grown woman standing in her driveway at 6 a.m., measuring grass with a ruler while frantically scribbling notes on a clipboard. Behind her, a moving truck idles as movers carry boxes toward the house she's about to abandon forever. The woman who once ruled an entire neighborhood with an iron fist, who made families cry with her petty demands, who turned a peaceful community into her personal dictatorship, she was now fleeing in complete and utter disgrace. But how did Margaret Hartwell, the most feared HOA president in Willowbrook Estates history, go from terrorizing innocent homeowners to becoming the laughingstock of the entire community? How did one man's calculated revenge campaign expose her dirty secrets and bring down her reign of terror so spectacularly that she couldn't show her face in public anymore? Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness one of the most satisfying HOA revenge stories ever told. This isn't just about petty neighborhood drama. This is about justice, persistence, and what happens when someone finally stands up to a tyrant who thought she was untouchable. The story you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about HOA power, and by the end you'll understand why sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to beat them at their own game. David Chen had always believed in the American dream. After 15 years of saving every penny from his job as a software engineer, he finally had enough for the down payment on his dream home in Willowbrook Estates, one of the most prestigious planned communities in suburban Phoenix. The neighborhood was everything he'd imagined. Perfectly manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, and homes that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. What David didn't know when he signed those papers was that he was about to enter a war zone disguised as suburbia. Willowbrook Estates wasn't just any neighborhood. It was a 200-home community built in 2018, designed with strict architectural guidelines that promised to maintain property values and ensure a harmonious living environment. The Homeowners Association governed everything from mailbox colors to the acceptable height of garden gnomes. On paper, it sounded reasonable, a small price to pay for guaranteed property appreciation and community standards. But every kingdom needs a ruler, and Willowbrook Estates had found theirs in Margaret Hartwell. Margaret wasn't just the HOA president. She was a woman who had found her calling in life through the intoxicating power of petty authority. At 53 years old, she had transformed what should have been a part-time volunteer position into a full-time obsession. Her husband worked long hours as a pharmaceutical sales rep, leaving Margaret with endless time to patrol the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, searching for violations with the dedication of a detective hunting a serial killer. She had moved to Willowbrook Estates 3 years earlier, and within 6 months, she had orchestrated a coup that removed the previous, more lenient HOA board and installed herself as president. Her campaign promise was simple: strict enforcement of community standards to protect everyone's investment. What the residents got instead was a dictator who measured happiness in fines collected and power in complaints filed. Margaret's routine was legendary among the residents, though none dared speak about it openly. Every morning at precisely 7 a.m., she would begin her neighborhood patrol, armed with a digital camera, a tape measure, and a 3-ring binder containing every single community rule and regulation. She knew the CC&Rs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, better than most lawyers knew the Constitution. Her victims were countless. There was an elderly Mrs. Patterson, who received a violation notice because her rose bushes extended 2 inches beyond the approved border. The Johnson family got hit with a $500 fine because their teenage son's basketball hoop was deemed unsightly and violated the community's aesthetic standards. Even the Ramirez family, who had just welcomed their first baby, found themselves facing fines because the baby's cry during nighttime feedings allegedly violated the community's noise ordinances. But Margaret's true genius wasn't just in finding violations. It was in her ability to weaponize the HOA's bureaucratic machinery. She had mastered the art of selective enforcement, turning the community rules into tools of personal vendetta. Residents who challenged her authority found themselves under constant scrutiny, while those who praised her leadership enjoyed mysterious immunity from her ever-watchful eye. Remember this name, Margaret Hartwell, because what she was about to do to David Chen would cross every line of human decency and turn a simple property dispute into an all-out war. The Willowbrook Estates HOA met monthly in the community clubhouse, a modest building that Margaret had transformed into her personal throne room. She presided over these meetings with the authority of a Supreme Court justice, complete with a gavel that she wielded like a weapon. Residents who attended these meetings described them as theatrical performances where Margaret would publicly shame violators, reading their infractions aloud like a teacher humiliating students in front of the class. The HOA's finances were another tool in Margaret's arsenal. Under her leadership, the association had accumulated over $200,000 in reserves, not through responsible budgeting, but through an aggressive fine system that generated more revenue than actual community improvements. The money sat in accounts that Margaret controlled with iron-fisted authority, approving expenditures only for projects that enhanced her power or served her personal interests. David Chen moved into his new home on Maple Lane in early March, full of excitement and optimism. His house was a beautiful two-story colonial with a modest front yard and a backyard perfect for the vegetable garden he'd always dreamed of planting. He spent his first few weeks unpacking, meeting neighbors, and familiarizing himself with the community guidelines that he had briefly skimmed during the purchasing process. The first sign of trouble came during his second week in the neighborhood. David had been working from home that Tuesday morning when his doorbell rang. Standing on his porch was a woman he didn't recognize, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression that could freeze hellfire. She introduced herself as Margaret Hartwell, HOA president, and informed David that his garbage cans violated community standards. The violation? David had left his trash cans at the curb for 37 minutes, past the 6 p.m. collection deadline. The fine was $75, payable within 10 days, with additional penalties for late payment. Margaret handed him an official violation notice, complete with time-stamped photographs taken from multiple angles, showing his innocent garbage cans sitting exactly where the city sanitation department required them to be. David was stunned. He tried to explain that he had been in back-to-back video conferences and hadn't realized the time, but Margaret cut him off with the cold efficiency of someone who had heard every excuse imaginable. The fine stood, she declared, and future violations would result in escalating penalties. But here's what David didn't know yet. Margaret Hartwell had already decided that the new resident on Maple Lane was going to serve as an example to the entire community. She had researched David's background, knew about his software engineering career, and had concluded that he represented exactly the type of resident who might challenge her authority if not properly controlled from the beginning. The garbage can incident was just Margaret testing the waters, seeing how David would respond to authority. What she discovered was a man who paid his fine without argument, apologized for the oversight, and promised to be more careful in the future. To most reasonable people, this would have been the end of the matter. But Margaret Hartwell wasn't most people. David's compliance wasn't satisfactory. It was suspicious. In her twisted worldview, residents who accepted violations too easily were either planning something or needed to be watched more carefully. And so began David Chen's education in the true nature of HOA tyranny, though he wouldn't understand the full scope of what he was facing for several more weeks. Margaret had found her next target, and she was about to unleash a campaign of harassment so systematic and relentless that it would change both of their lives forever. David's second violation came exactly 2 weeks after the garbage can incident, and it was so absurd that he initially thought it was a joke. Margaret had cited him for unauthorized landscaping modifications because he had planted 3 tomato plants in his backyard garden bed. According to the violation notice, vegetable gardens were not explicitly approved in the community's landscaping guidelines, which specified ornamental plantings consistent with neighborhood aesthetic standards. The fine this time was $150, and the notice demanded that David remove the non-compliant vegetation within 14 days or face additional penalties. David stared at the official HOA letterhead in disbelief. He had checked the guidelines before planting and found no specific prohibition against vegetables. In fact, the landscaping rules were deliberately vague, using phrases like appropriate plantings and community standards, without defining what those actually meant. This is where most people would have either complied quietly or filed a complaint with the HOA board. But David Chen was a software engineer, which meant he approached problems systematically and had an almost pathological attention to detail. Instead of immediately paying the fine, he did something that would prove to be Margaret's first major mistake in underestimating her opponent. He decided to research. David spent the next weekend in the community clubhouse, reviewing every HOA document, board meeting minute, and financial record available to homeowners. What he discovered was stunning. Margaret's interpretation of the landscaping rules wasn't just overly strict, it was completely inconsistent with how she applied them throughout the community. House after house in Willowbrook Estates had vegetable gardens, herb plantings, and other non-ornamental landscaping that had never been cited for violations. The Wilson family had a massive vegetable plot visible from the street. The Hendersons grew herbs along their front walkway. Even Margaret's own yard featured several tomato plants artfully disguised among her flower beds. But the deeper David dug, the more disturbing patterns he uncovered. Margaret's enforcement wasn't random, it was calculated. New residents received violations at dramatically higher rates than established homeowners. Residents who had previously challenged HOA decisions faced constant scrutiny. And most tellingly, residents who publicly praised Margaret's leadership at community meetings enjoyed virtual immunity from violations, even when their properties had obvious rule infractions. Now, here's where the story takes an interesting turn, because instead of confronting Margaret directly, David decided to respond like a software engineer. He started collecting data. He began photographing every property in the neighborhood, documenting landscaping choices, maintenance issues, and potential violations. He created spreadsheets tracking violation patterns, analyzed meeting minutes for recurring themes, and even started timing Margaret's patrol routes to understand her methodology. What he discovered was a pattern of harassment so systematic that it could only be intentional. Meanwhile, Margaret had interpreted David's silence as capitulation and decided to escalate her campaign. The third violation arrived just days after the landscaping fine's payment deadline. This time, she cited him for inappropriate exterior modifications, because he had installed a small bird feeder in his front yard without prior HOA approval. The violation notice was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation. It referenced obscure sections of the community guidelines, included time-stamped photographs taken from multiple angles, and demanded not just the removal of the bird feeder, but also a formal application process for any future exterior modifications, complete with architectural drawings and neighbor signatures. The fine was $200, and the notice warned that failure to comply would result in daily penalties of $25 until the violation was corrected. But Margaret's true genius revealed itself in the timing. She had deliberately scheduled the violation notices to arrive just before the monthly HOA board meeting, creating pressure for immediate compliance while limiting David's ability to challenge the citations through proper channels formally. This was psychological warfare disguised as community governance, and David was beginning to understand that he wasn't dealing with an overzealous volunteer. He was facing someone who had weaponized the HOA system for personal satisfaction. The breaking point came during David's 4th month in Willowbrook Estates. He had been careful to comply with every violation, removing the bird feeder, replanting his garden with approved ornamental plants, and maintaining his property to standards that exceeded those of most neighbors. He thought he had finally figured out how to coexist with Margaret's demanding oversight. He was wrong. The fourth violation was so outrageous that it would become legendary among Willowbrook residents. Margaret cited David for excessive noise violations because his home office air conditioning unit operated during daytime hours and allegedly exceeded the community's noise ordinances. The fine was $300, and the violation notice included sound level measurements taken with professional equipment at various times throughout the week. Here's what made this particularly absurd. David worked from home and ran his air conditioning during Phoenix's 115-degree summer days, just like every other resident in the community. Margaret had literally measured the sound of a properly functioning HVAC system and determined it violated noise ordinances that were designed to prevent things like loud parties and construction noise. But the violation notice included a detail that revealed Margaret's true motivation. She noted that David's air conditioning unit was unnecessarily disruptive to community tranquility and suggested that he consider alternative cooling solutions or modified work arrangements to minimize neighborhood impact. Margaret Hartwell was now trying to control whether David could cool his own home during Arizona summer heat waves. That's when David realized this wasn't about community standards or property values. This was personal. Margaret had decided that David Chen needed to be driven out of Willowbrook Estates, and she was going to use every tool at her disposal to make his life so miserable that he would have no choice but to sell his home and leave. But Margaret had made a crucial error in judgment. She had assumed that David would respond like her previous victims, with frustration, compliance, and eventual surrender. What she didn't understand was that software engineers don't just solve problems, they optimize systems. And David had been spending the last 4 months reverse engineering the most corrupt system he'd ever encountered. The war was about to begin, but Margaret didn't know that her opponent had already mapped the battlefield and identified her weaknesses. David Chen wasn't planning to fight Margaret Hartwell's war. He was going to fight his own. By late summer, David had accumulated over $1,200 in HOA fines for violations that ranged from the genuinely petty to the completely fabricated. Margaret had meticulously documented each citation with the precision of a forensic investigator and the creativity of a fiction writer. His mailbox was allegedly 2 degrees off the approved angle. His garden hose was visible from the street for more than the permitted time frame. His car was parked in his own driveway at an angle that violated aesthetic standards. But here's what Margaret didn't know. Every single violation notice she had sent to David had been scanned, digitized, and cross-referenced against community guidelines, previous enforcement actions, and similar violations throughout the neighborhood. David had built a database that would make the FBI proud, and what it revealed was going to destroy Margaret's carefully constructed empire of petty tyranny. The pattern was undeniable. Margaret had cited David for violations that she had ignored in dozens of other homes. She had invented interpretations of community rules that had no basis in the actual documents. And most damning of all, she had used her position to target specific residents while protecting others based entirely on her personal preferences. David had the evidence. Now he needed a strategy. And what he came up with was so elegant, so perfectly calculated, that it would not only expose Margaret's corruption, but turn her own weapons against her with devastating effectiveness. The real war was about to begin, and Margaret Hartwell had no idea what was coming. October 15th was a date that would live in Willowbrook Estates' infamy. It was the day David Chen decided to stop playing defense and go on the offensive with a strategy so methodical and devastating that it would expose Margaret Hartwell's corruption in the most public and humiliating way possible. David had spent weeks preparing for what he privately called Operation Transparency. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would use Margaret's own obsession with rules and documentation to destroy her credibility and reveal the systematic harassment she had been inflicting on the community. The first phase began at 6 a.m. that Tuesday morning, when David submitted 47 separate violation reports to the HOA, each one meticulously documented with photographs, measurements, and references to specific community guidelines. Every single violation was occurring on properties belonging to Margaret's allies or residents who had publicly supported her leadership. The reports were masterpieces of bureaucratic precision. David had learned Margaret's own documentation style and used it against her with surgical accuracy. He reported Mrs. Henderson's herb garden for unauthorized landscaping modifications, the same violation Margaret had cited him for months earlier. He documented the Wilson family's vegetable plot with the same photographic precision Margaret had used against his tomato plants. He measured mailbox angles, documented parking violations, and recorded noise infractions with the obsessive attention to detail that Margaret herself had established as the standard. But David's stroke of genius was including violation reports on Margaret's own property. Her front yard contained a decorative garden gnome that exceeded the approved height limitations by 3 inches. Her garbage cans had been left at the curb past the collection deadline on multiple occasions. David had photographs time-stamped with GPS coordinates to prove it. Most damaging of all, her own vegetable garden contained the same tomato plants that she had forced David to remove months earlier. David submitted all 47 violation reports simultaneously through the HOA's official channels, complete with a formal letter requesting immediate action and consistent enforcement of community standards. Each report followed the exact format that Margaret had established, using her own language and referencing her own precedents for similar violations. Margaret received the reports at 8:47 a.m. while conducting her morning patrol. David watched from his home office window as she stood in the street, frantically shuffling through page after page of violation reports, her face growing redder with each document she read. But David's plan was just getting started. Phase 2 launched that afternoon when David submitted a formal complaint to the HOA board requesting a special meeting to address systematic inconsistencies in violation enforcement and potential conflicts of interest in community governance. His complaint was 63 pages long, complete with statistical analysis, photographic evidence, and detailed documentation of every violation pattern he had uncovered. The complaint didn't just challenge Margaret's authority, it methodically dismantled her entire system of selective enforcement. David had created charts showing violation rates by neighborhood area, analyzed fine collection patterns, and documented the clear correlation between HOA board criticism and increased violation citations. His evidence was so comprehensive that it read like a federal investigation into municipal corruption. But the most devastating section of David's complaint focused on Margaret is personal conduct and potential legal violations. He had discovered that Margaret had been using her position to access homeowners' personal information for non-official purposes, had violated open meeting laws by conducting HOA business through private communications, and had potentially mismanaged association funds through unauthorized expenditures. Margaret's response was swift and predictable. She attempted to dismiss David's complaint through procedural objections. She tried to schedule the special meeting for a date so far in the future that residents would lose interest. But David had anticipated this move and had already distributed copies of his complaint to every homeowner in the community. What happened next was unprecedented in Willowbrook Estates' history. Residents who had suffered under Margaret's tyranny for years suddenly realized they weren't alone. The community Facebook page, which Margaret had previously controlled through loyal moderators, exploded with stories of harassment, inconsistent enforcement, and personal vendetta. Families shared violation notices they had received for infractions that were ignored on neighboring properties. Homeowners compared fines and discovered the arbitrary nature of Margaret's penalty system. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had been cited for rose bushes, revealed that Margaret had threatened to foreclose on her home over unpaid fines totaling $2,100. The Johnson family disclosed that their teenage son had stopped playing basketball in their own driveway because Margaret had made it clear that any noise complaints would result in immediate citations. Even residents who had previously supported Margaret began questioning her methods as David's evidence made the scope of her misconduct undeniable. But Margaret Hartwell wasn't going down without a fight, and her counterattack revealed the true depths of her vindictive nature. 3 days after David's complaint was distributed, he received a violation notice that was so outrageous it bordered on legal harassment. Margaret cited him for disruptive community behavior and violation of community harmony standards based on his submission of the violation reports and formal complaint. The fine was $1,500, and the notice demanded that David publicly retract his complaint and apologize to the community for spreading false and damaging information about HOA leadership. The violation notice included a threat that would prove to be Margaret's final mistake. She warned David that continued disruptive behavior would result in foreclosure proceedings against his property to collect unpaid fines and legal costs. Margaret Hartwell had just threatened to steal David Chen's home because he had dared to challenge her authority using the very system she had created. David's response was immediate and devastating. Within hours, he had forwarded Margaret's threat to a real estate attorney, the state HOA regulatory agency, and the local media. He also posted the violation notice on every community social media platform with a simple message: "This is what happens when you ask for fair enforcement of community rules." The community's reaction was explosive. Residents who had remained neutral suddenly understood that Margaret's harassment wasn't limited to rule violations. She was willing to destroy families to maintain her power. The realization that any homeowner could lose their property for challenging HOA authority united the community against Margaret in a way that nothing else could have achieved. But David saved his most devastating move for the special HOA meeting that Margaret had been forced to schedule for October 28th. He had discovered something in the association's financial records that would not only end Margaret's presidency, but potentially land her in serious legal trouble. Margaret had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. David's forensic analysis of the association's finances revealed a pattern of questionable expenditures totaling over $15,000. Margaret had approved payments for community research that coincided with her personal vacations. She had authorized professional development expenses for conferences that didn't exist. Most damaging of all, she had used association funds to hire a private investigator to research the backgrounds of residents who had challenged her authority, including David himself. The evidence was irrefutable, and David had prepared a presentation that would expose every detail of Margaret's financial misconduct in front of the entire community. He had also invited a representative from the state attorney general's office who investigated HOA fraud, along with a local reporter who specialized in municipal corruption stories. Margaret Hartwell's reign of terror was about to end in the most spectacular and humiliating way possible, but she still didn't understand the full scope of what David had uncovered. She thought she was facing an angry resident with some documentation. She had no idea she was about to be exposed as a criminal who had stolen from her own neighbors while terrorizing them with fabricated violations. The special meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse, and by 6:30, every seat was filled with residents who had finally decided they'd had enough of Margaret's tyranny. David Chen sat quietly in the front row, a laptop bag beside him containing enough evidence to destroy Margaret's reputation and potentially send her to prison. Margaret called the meeting to order with her usual imperious authority, completely unaware that she was presiding over her own public execution. The October 28th special meeting began like every other HOA gathering in Willowbrook Estate's history, with Margaret Hartwell wielding her gavel like a scepter and maintaining the theatrical authority that had intimidated residents for years. But within 30 minutes, her entire world would collapse in the most spectacular public humiliation that anyone in the community had ever witnessed. Margaret opened the meeting by attempting to dismiss David's complaint as frivolous harassment by a disgruntled resident who refuses to follow community standards. She had prepared a defense that relied on her usual tactics: bureaucratic intimidation, selective presentation of facts, and the assumption that residents would remain passive in the face of her authority. She had no idea that David Chen had spent months building an airtight case that would expose not just her harassment, but criminal conduct that violated state laws governing HOA management. David's presentation began quietly, with a simple PowerPoint slide showing violation statistics for the past 2 years. The numbers were stark. Margaret had issued 847 violation notices during her presidency, generating over $127,000 in fines. But the next slide revealed the pattern that would prove her undoing. 73% of those violations had been issued to just 31 homeowners who had previously questioned HOA decisions or failed to support Margaret's leadership publicly. The room fell silent as David methodically walked through his evidence. He showed photographs of identical landscaping violations that had been cited on some properties but ignored on others. He displayed charts demonstrating that residents who praised Margaret at meetings had violation rates 89% lower than those who remained neutral. Most damning of all, he revealed that homeowners who had challenged previous HOA decisions received violations at rates 12 times higher than community supporters. Margaret attempted to interrupt David's presentation multiple times, citing procedural objections and claiming that his evidence was taken out of context. But David had anticipated every possible objection and had prepared responses that used Margaret's own words and documentation against her. The turning point came when David revealed Margaret's use of HOA funds for personal expenses. The financial evidence was projected on a large screen for everyone to see: credit card statements, check registers, and invoices that told an undeniable story of systematic theft from the community association. Margaret had used HOA funds to pay for hotel stays during personal vacations, claiming they were research trips to study other communities. She had authorized payments for consulting services to companies that didn't exist, companies that were later revealed to be owned by her husband's business partners. Most shocking of all, she had spent $8,400 of association money to hire a private investigator to dig up personal information on residents who had opposed her policies. The room erupted when David revealed the investigator's reports, which included details about residents' employment histories, credit scores, and personal relationships. Margaret had been using community funds to spy on her own neighbors, collecting ammunition for future harassment campaigns. But David's most devastating revelation was still to come. He had discovered that Margaret had been deliberately creating violations to generate fine revenue that she then misappropriated through fraudulent expense claims. The association's bank statements showed a clear pattern. Violation notices would spike before major expense submissions, creating a cash flow that Margaret then redirected to personal use. Margaret's response to these accusations was the final nail in her coffin. Instead of addressing the evidence, she launched into a personal attack on David that revealed her true character. She accused him of being a troublemaker who was undermining community harmony and suggested that residents of his background didn't understand American community standards. The room fell silent. Margaret Hartwell had just made publicly racist comments in front of 200 neighbors, a state investigator, and a local reporter. Her words were recorded on multiple phones, and several residents had begun live-streaming the meeting on social media. David Chen looked up from his presentation materials and did something that nobody expected. He smiled. He calmly explained that Margaret's response perfectly demonstrated the personal animus behind her selective enforcement. He then revealed that he had been recording all of his interactions with Margaret for months, and that her pattern of harassment had included subtle but documented discriminatory comments about his ethnicity, background, and fit within the community. The state investigator, who had been taking notes quietly throughout the meeting, stood up and identified herself. She announced that based on the evidence presented, her office would be launching a formal investigation into HOA fraud and potential civil rights violations. She also revealed that Margaret's conduct had triggered mandatory reporting requirements that could result in criminal charges. Margaret's composure finally cracked. She began screaming at David, accusing him of orchestrating a conspiracy to destroy her reputation and threatening legal action for defamation and harassment. Her outburst was captured on multiple video recordings and would later go viral on social media platforms throughout Arizona. But the community hadn't finished with Margaret Hartwell yet. One by one, residents stood up to share their own stories of harassment, intimidation, and financial pressure. Mrs. Patterson revealed that Margaret had threatened foreclosure over unpaid fines for rose bushes that were perfectly healthy and properly maintained. The Johnson family disclosed that their teenage son had stopped participating in normal childhood activities because Margaret had weaponized noise ordinances against them. Even families who had previously remained neutral shared stories of intimidation and selective enforcement that painted a picture of systematic abuse of power. The meeting lasted until nearly midnight, and by the end, Margaret had been formally removed from the HOA board by unanimous vote of the residents present. The community also voted to immediately suspend all pending violation cases pending a complete review of Margaret's enforcement decisions. But Margaret's humiliation was far from over. The local news story about the meeting went viral, turning Margaret into a cautionary tale about HOA abuse that was shared across the country. The video of her racist comments and public meltdown generated hundreds of thousands of views and made Willowbrook HOA Karen a trending topic on social media. National news outlets picked up the story, and Margaret found herself the subject of think pieces about suburbia, racism, and the dangers of unchecked authority in residential communities. The state investigation moved quickly. Within 6 weeks, Margaret was charged with multiple felonies, including theft, fraud, and civil rights violations. The private investigator she had hired using HOA funds was also charged and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. The evidence David had compiled became the foundation for a criminal case that would eventually result in Margaret's conviction and a 3-year prison sentence. But the financial reckoning was equally devastating. Margaret was ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, return all misappropriated funds, and cover the legal costs of the association's recovery efforts. The total judgment exceeded $150,000, forcing Margaret and her husband to sell their home and declare bankruptcy. The house that Margaret had used as her base of operations for terrorizing the neighborhood sat empty for months before finally being sold at a significant loss. The new owners, ironically, were a young family with children who planted a vegetable garden in their backyard and installed playground equipment without seeking HOA approval. Actions that would have generated thousands of dollars in fines under Margaret's reign. David Chen became an unlikely hero in the community and beyond. His methodical documentation and strategic response to HOA harassment became a template that other residents across the country used to challenge corrupt community governance. He was invited to speak at homeowner rights conferences and consulted with attorneys representing victims of HOA abuse nationwide. The Willowbrook Estates community underwent a remarkable transformation after Margaret's departure. The new HOA board implemented transparent enforcement policies, eliminated most of the petty restrictions that had made residents' lives miserable, and established an appeals process for violation disputes. Fine revenue dropped by 85%, but community satisfaction soared to levels not seen since the neighborhood's founding. Property values, which Margaret had claimed to protect through strict enforcement, actually increased after her departure, as Willowbrook Estates developed a reputation as a well-managed community with reasonable governance. The fear and tension that had characterized daily life under Margaret's rule were replaced by the neighborly cooperation and community spirit that HOAs are supposed to foster. David still lives in his home on Maple Lane, where he maintains a beautiful vegetable garden that now serves as inspiration for other residents who no longer fear harassment for growing their own food. His bird feeder remains in the front yard, attracting songbirds that residents actually appreciate rather than cite for noise violations. The clubhouse where Margaret once presided over her tribunal of terror has been converted into a genuine community center where residents host social events, children's activities, and neighborhood meetings that focus on improvement rather than punishment. The atmosphere is so different that longtime residents sometimes comment that it feels like an entirely different community. But the most satisfying outcome is what happened to Margaret's carefully constructed database of violations and resident surveillance information. David convinced the new board to purge all records of Margaret's enforcement actions and start fresh with policies based on genuine community needs rather than personal vendettas. Years of accumulated threats, intimidation, and harassment documentation were ceremonially shredded at a community barbecue that celebrated the neighborhood's liberation from tyranny. Today, Willowbrook Estates is held up as an example of how communities can recover from HOA abuse and rebuild trust between residents and governance. David's story is taught in legal education courses about HOA law and resident rights. His methodical approach to documenting abuse and building legal cases has helped countless other homeowners challenge corrupt community leadership. Margaret Hartwell's story serves as a warning about what happens when petty authority goes unchecked and residents remain passive in the face of abuse. Her downfall demonstrates that even the most entrenched corruption can be exposed and defeated when one person decides to fight back with intelligence, persistence, and community support. The lesson of Willowbrook Estates isn't just about HOA reform. It's about the power of systematic resistance to injustice. David Chen proved that bullies, no matter how well-positioned or ruthlessly effective, ultimately depend on their victims' willingness to remain silent and isolated. When that silence is broken and isolation is replaced with community solidarity, even the most fearsome tyrant becomes powerless. As David reflected in a later interview, Margaret thought she was teaching me about power and control. What she actually taught me was that the best way to defeat a system built on fear is with transparency, evidence, and the simple refusal to be intimidated. The empty lot where Margaret's house once stood has been purchased by a developer who plans to build a community garden that will be open to all Willowbrook residents. It's a fitting symbol of how neighborhoods can heal and grow when freed from the shadow of petty tyranny. Margaret Hartwell learned the hard way that when you build your power on harassment, intimidation, and corruption, you're not creating strength. You're constructing the very foundation of your own inevitable downfall. And sometimes, justice is served with the precision of a perfectly documented violation notice. What would you have done in David's situation? How do you think communities can protect themselves from HOA abuse while maintaining reasonable standards? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this remind us that standing up to bullies isn't just possible. Healthy communities must thrive.